Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade. This video is a review of the masterful Republic serial, The Drums of Fu Manchu from 1940, and its only real available official release on the VCI 2-disc DVD set. Now, to talk about this serial, I've done some serial discussion on this channel before, but Republic is always the chief name among studios making serials. Republic serials were always not just a cut above the rest, but literally just plain above the rest. Only Universal with their serials started to come close, but no one put in as much effort, time, and care into their serials as Republic did. And that's why when you talk about serials, most people just talk specifically about Republic serials because they were so part and parcel above all the rest. And Drums of Fu Manchu is no exception. Now, this, of course, is dealing with the character of Fu Manchu, and anytime you bring up Fu Manchu with the character, you have to also dig into the baggage that comes along with the character created originally by Sax Rohmer in the original short stories and novels, which unfortunately do deal very heavily with the unfortunate racism at the time period, which was known as the Yellow Peril, and the books themselves are a giant part of what became a part of literature at the time, and also helped to unfortunately substantiate a lot of the unfortunate racism and the views that went along with this particular unfortunate section of pop culture at this time. Now, I've not yet read the original stories. I've always meant to because they are so hugely influential on the adventure genre in terms of literature, as they influenced many generations, including, obviously Indiana Jones and James Bond especially. So I still will finally get around to reading those. I've just always kind of put it off because I knew the contents within did have the unfortunate problem of the views some people had at the time. So you will have to always understand that the inherent racism of the character is going to carry into the various adaptations to degrees. Now, as I discussed in my review of the Kino Lorber release of the first two Paramount early talkies with Warner Oland, some of these adaptations try to dial some of that down or sidestep it enough with a strong enough story momentum that thankfully that becomes very much only surface material. And thankfully, that's what happens here in Drums of Fu Manchu. This is a Republic serial, so obviously the focus is on the action of the story and keeping everything moving at a particular pace. And thankfully, you don't get the speeches and diatribes pop up that you see in, say, for example, MGM's Mask of Fu Manchu, which is what sort of definitely makes that film hard to watch, are those speeches where all of a sudden the film stops and you have this awful stuff that they make Boris Karloff spout having to play Fu Manchu. And that's the other thing you have to deal with in the adaptations, is you're almost always having to see characters being played by Caucasian actors. So here you have that as well with Henry Brandon playing Fu Manchu, but the real highlight is his performance here, because what they do in the serial is they highlight his sort of otherworldliness. He is designed in terms of the costuming and the overall appearance to automatically be much taller than everyone else, and he doesn't even really seem like a human being in certain ways. He has a certain alien type presence which heightens the sort of feeling of, okay, now you're going against the master villain. This is sort of what Ian Fleming did when he created the Dr. No character, and then what we see in the film of Dr. No, who was very clearly patterned on Fu Manchu, and Fleming grew up on the Sax Rohmer books, and that was a great influence on him, which is why I've always kind of wanted to dig more into this material, and I have meant to read the books for some time. But as you can see, the influence of Fu Manchu and these stories and all the various adaptations has a extraordinarily long-reaching impact. And when you watch this serial in particular, which draws directly from a lot of the Rohmer stories, you will recognize a lot of things that seem very immediately familiar. There are several moments that are very much inspired both Indiana Jones, and there's even a couple moments that you see turn up in various permutations, even in some of the Bond films. And pretty much anything that's ever happened in the action-adventure genre can be traced back not just to serials, but also quite a lot of it to the Fu Manchu stories of Sax Rohmer. So you have to go in understanding that obviously you're going to see some characters who are supposed to be Chinese or Indian or other ethnicities being played by Caucasian actors, some with some makeup. This was a common practice in Hollywood at the time. And also this was at Republic, where they still didn't have the greatest budgets in the world, and serials were done on a very tight schedule with a very tight budget. So you do have to know going in, you are going to see a little bit of that. But again, what I really appreciated here is that they made Fu Manchu seem like an entity to himself, and just seeing him appear, he almost I know they had him actually wear at least lifts in his shoes, if not some slight stilts, because he literally appears a good foot taller than everyone else, and he has this magnetic presence that's heightened by the costume and the makeup and everything to give him this sort of otherworldly presence that's also fulfilled by Henry Brandon's performance. So this is quite probably not only the closest we get to the character as he's depicted in the novels, but also this is probably the best version of the character in any film adaptation. And you also get the sense of this is an intelligent being with a sense of honor and his own personal code, which also makes him a more fascinating character and adds to a lot of back and forth between the forces of good and evil in these stories. So again, this is a Republic serial. The focus is on action, and this is from the legendary directing team of William Witney and John English, which puts it right there in the cream of the crop of all film serials. These are the serials from this directing team of Witney and English that not only define the cliffhanger serial and are the pinnacle of the Republic serial, which of course is the best of the best in this genre, but William Witney himself is the person who revolutionized the action sequence and created the modern fight scene in terms of using the camera and staging and editing, along with incredible fight sequences and choreography with all these wonderful stuntmen they were working with to really build the action sequence as we know it today. So when you see a Witney English serial, the sheer dynamism of the action sequences means they have not dated at all one bit. And you basically, for the action set piece, you have before William Witney and you have after William Witney. It's that cut and dry. He is the greatest action director who ever lived. So when you have the partnership of Witney and English, and that was really because serials were so massive that they almost always were directed by a pair of directors. Witney was the one who focused more on the action. John English focused more on the interior and dialogue scenes, and they worked incredibly well together. So again, it's really the best of the Republic serials are the ones where they were the partnered directors, and they really seem to have fed off of each other really well and were able to mesh their styles. What's most interesting about this particular serial, though, Republic did have to pay for the rights to the character, so they did seem to put quite a bit more into the production of this. This is a 15-chapter serial instead of a 12 or 13 chapter, so that means, this was a premium investment. They did spend significantly more. This was, I think, the most expensive serial of that year. They usually made 2 to 3 per year. And at 15 chapters, you're looking at 4.5 hours for the overall runtime, which means there are a lot of cliffhangers, there are a lot of narrow escapes and things, but it also means that they have to try and maintain the story out longer. And that's probably this serial's one real issue, is that I think 15 chapters is kind of too long for any serial. And there's also a point at which the entire locale changes, which deals with the story that I'll get into in a minute. But it's the length of this being 15 chapters, of getting the rights to the Fu Manchu character, and the opulence of the production that really set this apart. So not only is this Republic a Witney English serial with their dynamic sense of action, but also this has an incredible atmosphere to it. Witney himself said in interviews that he was very proud of this serial because they strove to give it a sense of atmosphere, to give it a sense of mystery, and quite frequently they shot it like a horror film. That's what sets this apart, and you'll notice that immediately. There is a sense of mysticism. You are dealing with the arch villainy of Fu Manchu, who seems to have knowledge of every aspect of life that people have no clue about, and he won't just simply kill people in the easy way, but he's hell-bent on world domination. And right from the get-go, from the opening titles to the score by Cy Feuer, but it's really the photography that really hits it home. This is a very how should I put it? It's a very moody serial. Again, it is shot frequently to resemble a horror film. There are lots of dark interiors, lots of usage of shadow. It is far more intensive visually than most serials, and even Republic serials, because most they're not getting into a lot of camera opulence. But here they're really trying, and you get that sense. Even though the print quality of the versions we have are awful, you still get that sense of they really tried to shoot this frequently like a horror film, and that helps set it apart along with the longer 15-chapter length. And again, it makes sense, Republic spending the extra money to license this famous character. They're going to put more money into it, and they're going to put more time into it, and they put their best directing team of Whitney English on it. So you can tell they're hedging all their bets, and they're going all in on this serial, and it's really effective because overall, I think this is probably the best adaptation or best overall Fu Manchu story in all of cinema. And I've now looked at a number of these, and most of them are actually pretty good, along with the baggage that this character brings along, that you will have to acknowledge historical context and acknowledge the unfortunate negative aspects and things. That's just always going to be part and parcel with this character. But on an overall scale, even though MGM's Mask of Fu Manchu is wildly pre-code and has the wonderful camp humor sense and MGM opulence, and the Paramount early talkies with Warner Oland, I think, are actually rather strong, and especially for their time period. And some of the Harry Alan Towers films with Christopher Lee in the 60s are rather good, particularly the first two that Don Sharp directed. And then your results may vary with the other ones. This is the one that ticks all the boxes, and it moves with such an energy and has such a wonderful central performance by Henry Brandon as this version of Fu Manchu. And again, reading into it, this is the one that seems to be the closest to the adventure spirit of the original stories, and that fits in perfectly in the land of Republic serials. So you have all of this, and you have Republic going all in and making it a big, extravagant 15-chapter serial with the best directors of serials, period. The Drums of Fu Manchu is extraordinarily important, and actually one of the serials I would recommend to anyone. It is that good. It is one of Republic's best serials. Now, the story itself is actually quite similar to Mask of Fu Manchu, and this is actually pulling directly from the original Romer stories, but the basic plot is Fu Manchu is trying to retrieve the feudal pieces of Genghis Khan from the lost tomb of Genghis Khan, and if he can do so, then he can lead a revolt in and across Asia to try and overthrow all of the various British occupying forces, and then ostensibly go on to complete world domination, which is, of course, his primary goal. This is, again, the same plot overall that you get in Mask of Fu Manchu, but that is merely the setup. In most serials, there usually is a quest of sorts where you have both sides, both factions, the heroes and the villains, going after a particular thing, trying to achieve a certain goal. Well, here it is basically a quest. It's a race to get there first, which is always great for adventure films and trying to establish and then maintain a sense of tension. And this actually goes for most of the serial, but this is, again, where you get into the fact where I think really having it at 15 chapters is really kind of a bit too long, because there is a certain point about 3/4 to almost all the way through where the race part is actually over, and then you just kind of have the last few chapters is the sort of aftermath. So Had this been a 12-chapter serial, I think it probably would have been a bit more balanced, because another thing you have is the serial starts here in America, and we have the heroes led by Sir Nayland Smith, who is Fu Manchu's arch nemesis, and then, of course, Dr. Petrie, who kind of takes a back seat here, and then we have the sort of young, dashing lead of the story, Alan Parker, who sort of takes the place of apparently how it goes in the various Fu Manchu novels, where there's always some young guy that gets roped in and becomes the sort of action hero of each story along with Nayland Smith. And you see this in some of the other films, like the 60s Harry Alan Towers films. But Alan Parker here is essentially the action star of this serial, and then Nayland Smith is sort of the background, older, wiser advisor character. And then we have the others we kind of see pop up here and there all on the sort of hero side. And these battles go across the first, I'd say, really across the first 5 to 6 chapters or so. And then we actually switch and we go over to Asia, and the finale, the second half of the serial, takes place on location, essentially. And in most serials, that's where you'd really get cooking, with all of the death traps and the cliffhangers and the action really ramping up, because you're on location and you're out in the desert and you can go in the caves and all kinds of different things. But interestingly here, it's actually the earlier chapters in the U.S. where they're just going around cities and dealing with the brainwashed acolytes of Fu Manchu, who he essentially has an entire limitless army of, it seems. These are actually the more exciting sections, and there are some really great death traps and some really nice build-ups to the cliffhanger climaxes. So it's very interesting that in this serial, it's the stuff here, which was obviously shot on the sound stages at Republic or around the studio, that are more interesting and exciting than the seemingly what would be the more exotic stuff once they actually go over to China. But of course it's not. It's just the same wonderful Western locations in California that are part and parcel of all Republic films and all films of this era. But that's a really interesting distinction to make, and I think most everybody will feel that way. I don't think there's going to be a lot of people who think the second half is better than the first half. And again, this kind of goes back to, I think it's just a little bit too long at that 15 chapter length. And again, it's about in chapter 11 or 12 or so when the actual goal is established and the items are obtained, but then it kind of becomes sort of, they go back and forth and keep exchanging hands for the last couple chapters, and it seems almost kind of like it's padded out a little bit to get to that 15 chapter length. Other interesting things, this is one of those serials where not every chapter ends in a real action cliffhanger, and a very interesting move, and this is kind of, I think, going back to the attempt to give this serial more atmospherics and trying to make it feel like a mystery film or a horror film. Some of the actual cliffhangers, some of the chapters end not on a cliffhanger, but on a dramatic moment. There's a really striking one, again, in the U.S. sections, where they're in this house and they think they've got the particular piece protected that will lead them to the tomb, and they have to keep it hidden from Fu Manchu. But unbeknownst to them, and this is where the buildup starts to the chapter ending, Fu Manchu has infiltrated the house, and his acolytes have been taking down all the guards, and then the end of the chapter is they've essentially been knocked out, and the actual final image is Fu Manchu looking ultra malevolently at them and starts to grin a little bit because he has won this round, and that is the conclusion of the chapter. And you have to obviously come back to your theater next week for the next chapter. So it's not all action climaxes for the cliffhangers. Some of them are just nice dramatic build-ups, which is very striking because that's not something you commonly see in a cliffhanger serial. It's, again, something that helps to distinguish them. Probably the single most effective thing in this whole serial that I find absolutely phenomenal is going back to the title, The Drums of Fu Manchu. At several points, you actually see characters when there's, obviously impending doom or they're about to be killed off or something. They actually start hearing these drums. There's this really ominous drum sound that almost seems supernatural in ways. It's not explained where it comes from, but it is the literal drums of Fu Manchu as they hear their doom approaching. Well, that's used a few times in the actual serial in some of the chapters. But what Saifura does with his score, the end of every single chapter, when they start to build the editing rhythms and the peril is coming, they start playing the drums, and the drums start to build in intensity, and it builds to a ridiculous level that it does make the hairs on the back of your neck start to stand up, like all the proper great phenomenal cliffhanger ending of a chapter should do. And it's a really wonderful atmospheric effect, again going back to how they really strove to make this feel much more atmospheric, mysterious, and horrifying. That again, they really tried to make this feel otherworldly, and that really fits into the milieu of the Fu Manchu character, and it makes him seem so much more ominous and mysterious, which is something that you don't really get in any other of the various adaptations that I've seen so far. Some kind of hint at it a little bit, but this is the one that really drives that home. And again, with Fu Manchu himself appearing so otherworldly, that is a really wonderful touch. So it's probably my favorite thing in the whole serial is how each chapter ends with the building, ominous, supernatural drums of Fu Manchu, and of course it ties right into the title, which is beautifully done. Again, the performances are wonderful across the board, especially because this is a Republic serial, so everyone does well and acquits themselves well. But the real standouts, I think, again, are Henry Brandon as Fu Manchu, who he affects a certain accent. It's a little higher pitched, and it's not a particular language accent. It's like a voice affectation. It may throw you a little bit the first couple times, and you hear it in the first chapter, but it's really effective because that plus that he's built up to be so much taller and larger, and with the way they have done his hair and makeup, and he's got the bald head with the very striking eyebrows and things. It makes him seem very otherworldly and again almost sort of alien-like. But he also plays it with a sense of a sort of personal code and sense of honor that even if he's holding the girl hostage to try and motivate the heroes to give up the peace leading them to Genghis Khan's tomb, he won't go back on his word that he will let them go. Of course, he will probably let them go straight into a death trap that he didn't, mention, obviously, but he does have some sense of honor, which, is nice. You need that in a villain, I think, that they have some sort of, even if it's warped, some sense of a personal code that they adhere to. It sort of grounds them in a particular way. But then also the character Fu Manchu's daughter, Follow C, is in a lot of the films. Here she's played by Gloria Franklin, but they actually give her stuff to do, which is really great because usually she's just kind of there and she maybe gets to do a little bit here and there, like when you see her played by Myrna Loy in MGM's Mask of Fu Manchu. She gets to do a little bit here and there, but not a whole lot. And then Sai Chin plays the same character in the Harry Allen Towers 60s films, where sometimes she gets to do a little bit, but usually, unfortunately, not that much. But here, she's actually more of an active participant and basically the lead field agent for her father. And so she actually gets to do things, which I thought was very striking. And essentially, she takes the place of the villain's lead henchman, because that's essentially what her role is here. Again, this seems very much pulled from the original stories. Not only do they pull story elements, they pull characters, and they even pull directly some of the famous torture devices from and death traps from the stories. So when you see this serial, they will seem a little bit more thought out and elevated over your typical serial death trap. Well, that's because they were actually pulling from the stories. Usually, Republic and every other studio would license something and then just kind of do their own thing with it. But here it seems like they tried to at least pay a bit more attention to actually taking bits of materials from the various books and then fitting it into how they would work a serial. One of the most interesting ones is Fu Manchu actually has an actual replica of the Pit and the Pendulum and ties Alan Parker to it for the end of one of the chapters. And rather amusingly, he says, oh, I believe you may be familiar with this. Your American writer, Edgar Allan Poe, devised this in one of his stories, so I have constructed it myself. So in that scene, it's almost like he's been taking notes from Dr. Valen, the Bela Lugosi character in The Raven, who also built a replica of the Pit and the Pendulum and tied his would-be victims to it. And it's done really well, and it's legitimately real, and it's a beautifully done cliffhanger. But that was one I didn't expect, that they actually did the Pit and the Pendulum, and they gave Fu Manchu that line about Poe. So as a Poe nerd, I really appreciated that. That was a nice touch they didn't have to do. Another thing for classic film fans, Dwight Frye actually appears in this serial, and he's in the credits, but unfortunately he's just got this tiny bit part in one of the chapters as a museum curator. So it would have been great had he been able to get one of the leading parts, because he would have been fantastic in a serial, but at least he pops up here for a second. Serials will be great because you'll see familiar faces pop up here and there when they would be working at one of these studios for a little bit and maybe get thrown into the serial department. But it was just really surprising to see Dwight Frye pop up here for a few minutes. It's just unfortunate. He's just kind of got a bit part in one of the chapters. As I said before, this was hugely influential and rather successful, so you can actually make direct parallels when you're saying this to many other action and adventure stories. There are several scenes that seem very reminiscent to things that turned up in the Indiana Jones films, obviously, especially when you get to the end chapters and they're actually going into temples and things. And of course, the whole notion of a race between good and evil to a historical artifact, and they're fighting and squabbling over various pieces that, when combined, will lead them to said place and artifacts. Obviously very much in the Indiana Jones realm. But for Bond fans, there's a lot of Bond connections you could make here. There are at least two specific moments that do preface things in the Bond films. One in one of the and really the first chapter, where there's a spectacular train crash that ends for the first cliffhanger. The villains infiltrate the train there's a mailbag that's thrown onto the train, and then you see the knife blade split the bag, and the henchmen come out and then attack the conductor. Well, that was obviously pops up later in Live and Let Die for the climax. That this is, of course, just classical adventure material, so that these types of moments have happened time and time again. The other is another classic action adventure moment where, in the conclusion of one of the early chapters, the hero and heroine are left in a plane that is out of fuel and it's about to crash. So you could make and of course it's in a mountain range where they can't land, there's nowhere to land, and there's no way out, it seems. So you can obviously draw the parallel to both The Living Daylights and, of course, the opening of Temple of Doom. Those are just two specific moments, but this serial is chock full of those. I think those are probably some of my favorites of the cliffhangers, along with the one that's sort of just more of a dramatic moment. The other that I really love is, of course, in the second chapter, the hero gets the drop on Fu Manchu and thinks he's got him, but of course Fu Manchu has the trick switch under his desk that opens the trap door, and our hero falls into, of course, a giant tank filled with a man-eating octopus, and then he has to struggle for his life, and that's the end of chapter 2. That's the type of fun you just don't get in films anymore. It's just fight to the death with man-eating octopus, that's something you don't see anymore. This is, of course, glorious fun, but that one may be my favorite of the cliffhangers in this, just because it's so beautifully classical adventure material and just over the top in all the right moments. Because, of course, Fu Manchu would have a tank with a man-eating octopus under his desk to dispose of henchmen who have displeased him. You can draw the line all the way, obviously, to Blofeld's Piranha Pool and You Only Live Twice and beyond. But again, it's wonderful to see Republic doing a classic serial adaptation of material that inspired so much that came afterward in the action-adventure genre. And the fact that they really tried to make this something a bit different and a bit special is what sets this apart and makes it one of the great cliffhanger action-adventure serials for all time. Again, my only real complaint is that it's I think too long at 15 chapters, so that's why it starts to get a little bit repetitive. And again, once they actually go to the east and they're going around in the desert and things, that's when the repetition really starts to increase, and it just doesn't have the snap and all of the wonderful mystery vibe and horror vibe to it that the earlier chapters do, because they do play a lot with light and shadow and all the interiors and things. So overall, I think this is one of the great serials of all time. It is one of Republic's best serial efforts, and it is from the legendary team of William Witney and John English, who did produce the best of the best in terms of film serials. So this is a perfect serial to watch if you've never seen one before. If you've never seen a Republic serial, this is one of the must-watch serials, even though I do think it gets on a little bit too long because they stretched it out to 15 chapters. But outside of that, this is, I think, the best adaptation of Fu Manchu on film there is. It thankfully does do away with quite a lot of the inherent racism of the character outside of, I think there's maybe a fleeting mention or two across the 15 chapters of the sort of unfortunate yellow peril nonsense. And of course, when you see the various tribesmen and masses of people that Fu Manchu is trying to win them over by obtaining the equipment of Genghis Khan, that can obviously be viewed as rather simplistic and not the greatest depiction of native peoples, but that's not what the story is about. That's really more of a backdrop. Again, you also have Caucasian actors playing the villains and some of the henchmen. There is some makeup, but it's done in a way for the henchmen to try and make them seem, obviously not normal people. They have been essentially not brainwashed, but essentially mind-washed by Fu Manchu, and they have no will of their own, and they have gone through his indoctrination process, which makes him even more nefarious. But they have a wonderful sort of creepy vibe to them themselves, and they're of course known as the dacoits. But it makes Fu Manchu as a villain seem all the more ominous, that he has this private army of beings who have no will but the will of the head villain, that makes him seem much more ominous. But you will have to deal with those particular issues still being inherent. But because this is a Republic serial and the focus is on action, and they really tried to make the spirit of the stories come across, this, I think, is the best overall Fu Manchu film there is, even though it's a 15-chapter Republic serial. It seems to really get the spirit of the original stories across, and it really transformed them into a wonderfully cinematic but pure action-adventure experience, chock full of the amazing, iconic Whitney English action set pieces and endless, amazingly staged fistfights, wonderful cliffhangers, some really dramatic ones, and some atypical elements for serials, particularly in the staging of the serial overall, really going for the vibe of a mystery or horror film. So that's why it's so unique, I think, for not just Republic serials, but serials overall. This is something where, again, you have a studio really trying to put more into it, and it really does show. So that's why Drums of Fu Manchu is one of the all-time great adventure serials, and I think the best overall adaptation of Fu Manchu that has ever been. So that brings us to the VCI DVD from 2005. So to talk about the packaging, this is a very straightforward 2-disc DVD. They have used the original poster artwork sized on a DVD, but unfortunately, because this is VCI from years ago, it doesn't look all that fancy and kind of almost looks like one of those cheapy public domain DVD copies. But don't let yourself be fooled. This is the actual VCI release. You can always tell by their badge on here. The rear is pretty plain, and unfortunately, it does have some spelling errors on it because this was VCI back in 2005. It is what it is. This is the only real official release. They did do a VHS release in 2001, and that's the only other official version, and this is basically a port of that. So this serial has never really gotten any sort of proper restoration work, and it's never gotten a fancy release. However, I will give it to them that they did make an actual booklet, which, it's basically just giving you the chapter listings, but at least they went to that effort. And then the other part of the booklet is just advertising some of their other serial DVDs, which are all kind of all over the place in terms of the video quality, depending on what masters they were using. Now, the serial is actually spread out over 2 DVDs, which is great, so that way they're not shoving everything onto a single disc and you're getting all kinds of compression problems. However, this is a 15-chapter serial, which is about 4.5 hours, so there's no way in heck you're going to get everything onto a single disc, and if you tried to, I don't know how bad that would look in terms of the compression. So this is one of the serials that will always have to at least be 2, if not really 3 discs. So if anyone ever does this, even on Blu-ray, it probably should be 3 discs just to, get the compression up to a nice level and not have everything shoved down and squeezed onto too little space, onto too few discs. Now, fortunately, what I was saying about this being sort of a port of their VHS master, to talk about the picture quality, this is where it gets really rough, because this is a really rough watch. The quality is very, very poor and is really no different to all of the crappy public domain and other weird uploads you'll find on the internet. And when you look up this serial, and you can even see it on YouTube, it's been uploaded a bunch of different times because of the sort of public domain status. The best of them is actually basically just a copy of this DVD. So when you see the best of the various uploads looking like absolute crap, that's not a good sign. This is filled with damage throughout. You're obviously going to see tears, scratches, missing frames, but the transfer itself, again, this is a port essentially of their VHS tape from 2001, and if you've ever seen how bad VHS tapes could look of serial transfers, I mean, serials in general are not treated well on home video, but unfortunately with this, the contrast is shot, the black levels are shot, it looks really terrible throughout, and it is unfortunately a bit of a chore to try and watch through this whole serial, even in this, which is the best available version. This does unfortunately mean that the beautiful visuals and the beautiful style they tried to achieve here is a lot harder to ascertain because the transfer quality is so poor. Some chapters do thankfully look a little bit better because the film print elements varied, but also you do have to deal with a very noisy and problematic soundtrack as well. And since there are continual jumps and things, sometimes there are slight jumps in the soundtrack along with hiss and warble and thumps and ticks and pops and things. So this is basically an as-is presentation, and unfortunately this is all there is. And now this has, I don't know if this is still in print anywhere, but it is getting harder to find. So it took me quite a while to actually track down the actual VCI DVD, and they advertise it as being digitally remastered, so I thought it was a newer transfer. But as soon as I popped it in and I realized they did a VHS tape release in 2001, I realized very quickly this is just basically a DVD copy of that VHS master. So it's a step up from their VHS tape in that you're actually getting standard def 480p on a DVD from a VHS master instead of watching it on those tapes, but it is the same, and it's still horrible in its picture quality, but unfortunately this is all we have officially. Now, there is a entity known as the Serial Squadron. They have a website where they do scans and made-to-order DVD-Rs of various serials, which again, the legal status of serials is kind of all over the place, but most of them are in the public domain. The Serial Squadron's releases apparently are some of the best quality for certain serials, and then others, it kind of depends on, you have to really dig into it to figure out, okay, well, is there a good official release, or do I have to go to something like the Serial Squadron? Now, apparently they have done a version of Drums of Fu Manchu from a 16 millimeter print scan. They have a little sample clip on their website that I looked at, and it does look better for the most part than the equivalent section of their sample that I looked at compared to this. But overall, I don't know if it's entirely worth it to go for that release. And again, because this is under Republic, that means it's technically in the Paramount library, so I think its legal status is kind of in a gray area, because technically Paramount still has the rights to all the Republic serials, which is why they've never been reissued outside of 1 or 2, and those that Kino put out on Blu-ray, for example, have been licensed and scanned by Paramount, just like the Universal serials that VCI is doing are from Universal. So even though a lot of these serials are being uploaded as if they are, free to license in the public domain, for Republic and Universal, and of course also Fox as well, that's technically not true. It's again sort of a gray area no one's really dug into, but if you do go into sort of gray market releases, you do have to keep in mind it's kind of a gray area in terms of the legality of that release. So for this, the only official version here is this VCI release, which is unfortunately just, it's a really hard watch. This will take you right back to the old days of watching public domain VHS tape copies of things, because that's all you could get back in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, it will take you right back to that. So unfortunately, this is horrible for the presentation quality, but that this is just all there is. So you will have to keep that in mind. This VCI DVD is your best option officially. It's the only actual official release there is, but the quality is atrocious. So please do keep that in mind. And if you can find a copy of this, I would recommend this serial to anyone, but you might actually want to take a look at one of the YouTube uploads just to get an idea of how bad the quality is. And I will link to the best one I found, which seems to be taken from this source. So you can actually see just how poor the quality is in picture and sound for yourself before you try and track down this DVD like I did. And then, yeah, this serial needs to be restored. This serial needs a scan badly. I mean, this is just an appallingly poor presentation. It's like you're watching an old VHS tape transferred from some source from who knows where, at least 16 millimeter. I don't even think this was transferred from 35. It's that poor. But it is what it is, and unfortunately, this is the best we have. So this is what you'll have to try and find for an official physical release, but do keep in mind the quality is appallingly bad. Now, there are actually some extras here. VCI credits a photo gallery, which is a simple, very very small, but they actually do have a gallery of some photos for the production. They do have some cast and crew biographies. They're rather small, but at least they're there. They were trying, and I appreciate any sort of effort, particularly from a small company, and VCI is not known for their supplemental features, so at least it's something. And then there's also listed a video commentary by Scarlet Street publisher Richard Valley. What this is actually a little 10 to 14 minute piece where he talks about the serial and hits some on the high notes, but it's not really a commentary. And also, weirdly, they actually repeat it on both discs, so it's the same piece, but it's actually included on disc 1 and 2. So I don't know why it's repeated twice, but I guess if you wanted to watch it again, you can. So at least there's some sort of bonus. Doesn't really tell you anything that you couldn't find out by watching the serial or reading the Wikipedia article, but at least it's something for an extra. This also has custom menus, but unfortunately they are a little bit annoying because every time you hit something, you have to wait through a little animatic that goes on, and it repeats every time you do it, and it has accompanying music that's quite loud. So the menus are kind of annoying, but at least it has a menu and it has chapters, so at least to give it that. I don't really expect a lot from a VCI release at this time point. So at least there's something in terms of supplementals, and it has a menu and it has chapters and it's spread out over 2 discs. But that's all I can say positively about this VCI DVD. And the fact that they credit it as, digitally remastered, I mean, that's just kind of insulting. All they did was transfer their VHS master, and yeah, it's even got the slightly cheap plastic that kind of has an odor to it. So, this looks like a cheap public domain release, because that's kind of sort of what it is. It's VCI in 2005, so it's just, it's just a couple steps slightly above, your usual suspects like Alpha Video and others. So that's what you have to expect coming into this. But this is still better than all of the various cheapy public domain label releases that have existed of this. This is the best, unfortunately, you can do. This is all there is officially. And of course, it doesn't bode well when you find a bunch of spelling errors on the back of the case. So it is what it is. But looking at this, it doesn't look like an actual fancy official studio label release. This is VCI circa 2005. So if you've had any experience with VCI DVDs in the past, this is pretty much going to be what you'll expect quality wise. So those are my thoughts on the VCI DVD release of the masterful Republic serial directed by William Witney and John English, The Drums of Fu Manchu, which is not only one of the best Republic serials ever made and one of the highlights of the Witney English serials, which are probably the best serials ever made overall, the ones they directed together, but it's also got so many unique elements to it that set it apart from most serials, along with the extended 15-chapter length. And again, for my money, this is probably the finest Fu Manchu film adaptation overall across all the various film adaptations and different iterations of the Sax Rohmer character. From my understanding of the books, which again I have not read yet, and all the various bits of critical commentary I've read and all the research I've done, this seems to be the closest in terms of spirit to the adventure stories that Rohmer was writing. And it manages to maintain that throughout in the spirit of the Republic serial without having as much of the unfortunate inherent negative aspects of the character. So like the early talkie Paramount films I discussed previously in my review of the Kino Blu-ray, this adaptation manages to circumvent a lot of those negatives. So if you've never experienced anything with the Fu Manchu character, and you might be curious about the sort of start or early days of action adventure in terms of the cinematic realm, this I think would be a good place to start. Of course, Mask of Fu Manchu that MGM made is the most famous of all the Fu Manchu films, but it's also quite infamous for the content and the general just some of the really cringe-inducing stuff that's in there. Even though it's got glorious pre-code fun and gore because it's one of the great pre-code films, but it's got a gigantic cringe factor, and of course was edited years after the fact to rip all of that out. So this again manages to circumvent quite a lot of that. There is some still inherent, but because it's also a Republic serial, it's not going into that stuff. It's going into more of the action-adventure realm in a pure fashion. And its influence can be felt to this very day in any action film. And the action itself still is some of the greatest action in all of cinema history. Again, the action film would not exist without William Witney. He is the greatest action director who ever lived, and you see any moment of the action in a William Witney, John English serial, or any of the action here in The Drums of Fu Manchu, you will get that immediately. This is seeing the action sequence discover itself. That's how revolutionary the Witney English directing team and their serials are for the development of the action film and the action sequence. And all of that in a serial that's going all out in production values and going for this incredible sense of atmosphere really makes it such a unique experience. And again, I think the finest Fu Manchu adaptation in all of films. So I would recommend this to anyone who loves action and adventure films. Any Bond fan or any Indiana Jones fan will have to see this. It is so important to the development of action and adventure, and it manages, again, to get the spirit of the original stories across in the realm of the Republic serial, which is the finest of all cliffhanger action adventure serials. It's just unfortunate that all we have is this really crummy presentation on the VCI DVD. But again, officially, this is the best you can do, and it's getting trickier to find. So you might want to check out the quality of some of the uploaded versions all over YouTube first to get an idea of what you're going to be looking at. But if you want a copy on physical media, this VCI DVD is the only real option outside of going to the Serial Squadron release. So I will have all of the relevant information in the description below for links to those and to some of the online uploads you can check out here on YouTube. But I just wanted to talk a bit at length about this because I had not gotten to see this serial before, but I knew its reputation, and since I was already reviewing some of the Fu Manchu films, I thought it would be the perfect time to actually look at the serial, and then I managed to actually find this VCI DVD. So unfortunately, the quality is very poor, and it does unfortunately detract from, it makes it harder to appreciate the visual splendor that they were able to achieve in this serial. But even with that, you can still see and acknowledge and feel that this is everybody really putting in 110% in terms of effort across the board, and it remains one of the finest cliffhanger serials ever made. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films and adventure serials and physical media has been at least somewhat fun and informative. And as always, please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep film culture, serial culture, and physical media alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Oh no, what'd I do? I hear the drums. I hear the drums! I hear the drums! There must be doom approaching! No!